Now let's jump right into the next story, which has to do with a tweet by President Obama. And I think President Obama is drawing exactly the wrong lessons on pandemic preparedness, or he's saying something, I should say, he's saying something that has a little bit of truth to it, but he's ignoring a huge error that he and many others have made. So here's the tweet in question. We've seen all too terribly the consequences of those who denied warnings of a pandemic. We can't afford any more consequences of climate denial. All of us, especially young people, have to demand better of our government at every level and vote this fall. Well, I definitely believe we should be demanding better of our government in this, and members of all parties. There's a ton to criticize, and I've criticized in other places, but there's this seeming analogy of, oh, well, the idea is to flesh it out what he's implying. It's just a tweet, but he's saying, well, these scientists have warned us that we're causing a climate catastrophe, and we didn't listen to them. And just as we didn't listen to the scientists who warned about this pandemic catastrophe. So one thing that's interesting to look at is, okay, well, President Obama, you were in a position to do a lot about pandemics in the past and to bring a lot of attention to pandemics. So one thing I decided to look at is, okay, well, in your public communications over the years, how much did you talk about pandemics? So let's see, where did I find this? So what I did is I searched on Twitter, and I did the Twitter historical search. And so the first thing I searched for is, okay, what did President Obama historically say throughout all of his history on Twitter? What did he say about pandemics? Because he had a big public forum. He still does. And so now we look at this, and I'm just going to go down it. Okay, so we see March 17th. Okay, everyone's talking about it now, and these are a little out of order. We see stuff back to 2016. Okay, but this is the gun, quote unquote, epidemic. And then, okay, this is the tweet I mentioned. And okay, gun violence epidemic, pandemic, but this is new. This is all March. Okay, so what has he said? This is searching the whole history. March. Okay, yeah, everyone's talking about it in March. Okay, he talks about Ebola in 2014. March this year. Okay, crime epidemic, AIDS epidemic. Now, you might think this is going to be a long time because he must talk about this a lot, but you're going to see it's actually quite a short page. So it talks about insurance, March 4th, coronavirus, okay, 2013, AIDS epidemic. You're not seeing anything about warning about pandemic preparedness. And there are definitely some people who've been warning about it, as we'll see, but it has not been Barack Obama and many of the other politicians now saying, oh, we should have listened to the scientists. It's interesting that they are not doing this. Sorry, just going to another screen here. So now, as I mentioned, some people have been warning about this kind of thing. So a friend of this show, actually several years ago, I had on Dr. Amish Adalja to talk about the threat of a pandemic, including what needs to be done about it. And so here we have some quotes from him. These are earlier quotes, but he's referencing, in particular, let's look at number 2. Once SARS appeared in 2003 and we knew that coronaviruses had this potential, it really was imperative that we develop countermeasures to be able to take coronaviruses off the pandemic list. And now it's 17 years later, and we're seeing what happens when you don't have vaccines. So people like Dr. Adalja have been sounding the alarm, but why haven't they been listened to? Well, one thing we can see is if we look at President Obama's tweets. Now let's look at what he has to say about climate and how many times has he tweeted about climate change. If we look at this, now this is going to be a long scroll, and this isn't even the whole history. If I look through it, it goes only back to 2016 because he's been talking about it so much that they won't even show you enough results. This is all, recent stuff. So what's been happening here, interestingly, I mean, we can keep going down, is just he's been really fixated on this issue of climate. He hasn't been, broadly speaking, looking at a whole variety of threats that specialized scientific knowledge can tell us about, and then really selecting them and drawing attention to a lot of them and being proportional uh, about them, as we'll see. It's there's this real fixation um, on climate. So let's go back here. Oops, sorry. So, not many people, including President Obama, from either party and not many public officials have been talking about pandemics. What they've been talking about, though, is climate and catastrophic climate change. And this is something that has been worrying me for a while. And I've talked about this in the past how, I mean, one refrain of mine is, and I'm not claiming I'm some visionary on pandemics, I'm not, but the thing I would refer to often was, in particular, the thing that bothered me was antibiotic uh, resistant bacteria. And the reason I generally worry about biological things, I worry about biological threats because I'm really concerned about things that deliberately want to hurt us. Now, in a sense, a bacteria or a virus doesn't want to hurt us. It just wants to survive and it comes at our expense. But nevertheless, its interests are against ours. Whereas with climate, despite the way it's portrayed, when we increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, there's no forces that are angry at us, though it's often portrayed that way. It's just, oh, there's a change in the system. And there's a question of, okay, what changes does that lead to and how big are they and how many are positive and how many are negative? But there's not actually any force that is antagonistic to us. It could be that the new arrangement with more CO2 is better. It could be that it's worse, but it doesn't have a goal that's really against us. Whereas with these organisms, they do actually have goals against us. And so if we don't have the means to deal with them, that's been scary to me for a long time, much, much scarier than climate. But for most people, climate has been, and most officials, climate has been the obsession. For example, President Obama, as his head science advisor, appointed this man, John Holdren. And so John Holdren, as I've documented in The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, he predicted in the mid 1980s that there'd be 1 billion climate-related deaths from famine by the year 2020, which we are now at. And instead, there's actually been a mass feeding of the world. The world is much better fed now than it was in the mid-80s, largely because of fossil fuels, fossil-fueled agriculture, specifically diesel-powered tractors and natural gas-generated fertilizer. That has helped us feed a world of 8 billion better than the world of 4 billion was fed several decades ago. So you've had this track record of people claiming that we're causing catastrophic climate change, and that's been the fixation, and it's been to the exclusion of everything else, even though if we look at the data, there is no climate catastrophe. This is an important distinction. Climate change and climate catastrophe are not the same thing. I do believe there's been some climate change. We've increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from 0.03% to 0.04%. And we can expect that will have some warming influence, and I believe that it has. But overall, the real question is this something that has made climate more dangerous for human beings, and is it on track? And the data I always point to that are always denied by the so-called climate believers are the data on climate-related deaths. Or you can think of it as the climate death rate. What percentage of people die from climate-related causes like extreme heat, extreme cold, flood, drought, etc. And if we look at the data from nonpartisan sources, it's unambiguous. As we've put more CO2 into the atmosphere, which is a byproduct of getting more energy from fossil fuels, climate-related deaths have gone way down. They've gone down about 98% over the last century. So the climate death rate is 1/50th of what it used to be. So there is no climate catastrophe. And the basic logic is that nature doesn't give us a safe climate that we make dangerous. It gives us a very dangerous climate that we need to make safe. And with fossil fueled machine power, billions of people have made themselves far safer from all kinds of climate dangers. And there's every reason to believe we can do so in the future. But because there's been this fixation on climate and this catastrophizing on climate, it's totally monopolized people's concern about risk. And so all the focus has been, oh, what are we doing to climate? How do we deal with that? And there's not even much of a focus on how to deal with it, because the only way you could really deal with it in a practical way is figure out how to make lower carbon energy cheap. Otherwise, as I've talked about, most people aren't going to do it because energy is so valuable that people aren't going to sacrifice much in terms of less available energy to them. But and so people are, it's mostly symbolic stuff where people just are saying, oh, well, I support solar, I support wind, I buy a Tesla, which is an overwhelmingly fossil fueled car in every dimension. But there's just been this fixation, and that we only have so much attention. So this has been a huge, huge mistake to fixate on this real climate change, but imaginary climate catastrophe to the exclusion of everything else. And President Obama is one of the guiltiest people here. When he was running for president, he talked about slowing the rise of the seas, which he definitely didn't do, but he didn't talk much about pandemic preparedness. So this is the problem with climate change fixation. It blinds you to real threats. So what should we do? Well, the grain of truth in what President Obama is saying, what others are saying, is science definitely needs to inform policy. We need to be, when we're concerned about different threats to our lives and our freedom, we need the best science possible. But we have to do a couple things. One is we have to be proportional about threats. So we have to look not just at something that happens to be presented to us, but we have to look at what are all the different threats and what could those amount to. And this is a really good time to start thinking about, hey, what are the next things that could happen? And I think there's a lot in the software realm that we could be concerned about in terms of hacking. There's other stuff in the biological realm that we should be concerned about. Hopefully there's more attention being paid there. I think the stability of our grid is a huge, huge issue, both because we're undercutting the reliability of our electricity sources, and also because it's just a target for different kinds of terrorism. And if you think having a virus, this caliber of virus going around, and it's a pretty bad virus, but if you think this virus is bad, think about the power going out for a few weeks. I mean, that is the complete destruction of our ability to live. 8 billion people or 330 million people in the US, like, we cannot live without electricity for any meaningful amount of time. So we should really be looking at these things. We should look at them proportionally. And part of that is we want to be looking at them from a human flourishing perspective. So we really want to focus on how big is this threat from the perspective of human life. And part of what I've argued is going wrong with the climate issue is people are acting like if we're changing climate, that's a bad and catastrophic thing, versus looking at, oh, well, how much are we changing climate? Is that bad at all? And even if it is a little bit bad, how much good comes with it? So we need to be proportional and look at things from a human flourishing perspective and look forward. But part of that is we cannot afford to continue to be fixated on this one thing, because there are many, many, many bigger concerns. And we don't just want to learn the lesson here that pandemics are a problem, although that's a good lesson to learn, but that there are a lot of threats that we need to keep our eyes